He is currently pastor of St. John's United Methodist Church in Watertown since 2002. His 30 years of ministry have taken place in such cities as New York, Washington, and numerous communities around New England. He's been the pastor of local churches, a community organizer, staff member, and director for many national peace and justice organizations. Reverend Clark served as the media liaison for the plaintiffs in the wrongful death suit action King versus Jowers in November and December of 1999. After 5 weeks of testimony and only 70 witnesses, the jury took only 1 hour to find Loyd Jowers liable for the death of Dr. Martin Luther King and to conclude that a conspiracy had indeed resulted in his death. In the 37th anniversary of Dr. King's death, I think if you have not had the chance to hear Reverend Mike Clark in the past, you're in for a real interesting history lesson. Please welcome Reverend Mike Clark.
Well, thank you for being here. And I have seen some of you before, and it's good to see you again. And it's always important, I think, to take time, even in the midst of busy lives and busy work, and even busy organizing activities, to take a moment on a day like today and reflect a bit on our history. And so I'm glad to be here again this year. It is 38 years ago tonight that Martin Luther King stood in Riverside Church in New York City, where I was on the staff for 6 years in the late 70s and early 80s. It's 38 years ago tonight that he stood and made a speech which I think led directly to his death. If we went down in Greenfield Center right now and stopped 100 people on the street and said, have you ever heard any speech by Martin Luther King? I think 100 people would say, August 1963, I have a dream. If you said, have you heard a second speech by Martin Luther King? They'd say, maybe 50. Yeah, something about going to a mountaintop, and it was the night before he was shot, and it was kind of eerie. You know, if you pushed it, said, how about a third speech or a fourth speech? I think those two are the ones that we know. The one 38 years ago tonight is the most important, I would suggest. And it sounded like this. Speaking to a crowd of 3,000 people in the Riverside Church, and he had not yet publicly come out against the war, and he said this: as I've walked in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I've tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. He also said, speaking of the Vietnamese, what do peasants think as we ally ourselves with landlords and as we refuse to put any action into our many words concerning land reform? What do they think as we test out our latest weapons on them, just as the Nazis tested out new medicine and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe? He went on to say, 38 years ago tonight, somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and a brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. And I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war has been ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours as well. He went on to say, the world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit we have been wrong from the beginning, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people, and the situation is one in which we must be ready to turn sharply from our present ways. He concluded this way, the war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. If we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and laity concerned committees for the next generation. He might have said for the next generations, plural. They'll be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They'll be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They'll be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We'll be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end unless there is significant and profound change in American life and policy. Such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as children of the living God. He concludes, I'm convinced that if we're to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, this is 1967, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant threats of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. 38 years ago tonight, he stood in Riverside Church and preached that sermon. Tonight at Riverside Church in New York, 3,000 people will gather again in an event called Return to Riverside with Martin Luther King. 3,000 people will be there this evening to once again commit themselves to this much broader agenda for making the world a less unhappy and a less unjust place. 38 years ago tonight, that's what he said. 37 years ago tonight, he was assassinated. And I would like to suggest that this speech is not only a prophetic declaration of the truth, it was, in a sense, his death warrant as well. So let's take a little bit of a look at what happened in the months after that speech. There were, in Martin Luther King's last 12 months of life, and it was exactly 1 year to the day after the speech that he was murdered, there were three things in his heart, on his mind, and in his life. The first was the continuation of the work that he had been doing for some 13 years in a national, public way around civil rights and human rights. But there was also now the additional matter of the war in Vietnam, for which he got no support when he made this speech. Major funders pulled back. Other organizations in the civil rights movement criticized him. It was clear that this was not a popular stand to take. And so his second piece of an agenda was the war. The third was what came to be called the Poor People's Campaign, as he began to address the question of the gap between the rich and the poor in the United States. And his plan in the summer of 1968 was to take hundreds of thousands of poor people to Washington, D.C., not for a day or a weekend, but for as long as it took, and to disrupt the workings of the U.S. government until the issue of poverty was addressed. And so for the 12 months between this speech and his assassination, that really was what Martin Luther King's life was about. He had become, with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, a truly world citizen. But in the last year of his life, he also was the strongest and most courageous spokesperson for this much broader agenda of social change. In the spring of 1968 in Memphis, a garbage workers' strike began. It began in February because 2 garbage collectors had been ground up by a malfunctioning machine, caught in a machine that needed to be fixed and hadn't been repaired, Complaints about it had been lodged with their superiors, but they had been ignored, and so they were ground up in a trash compactor. And so the garbage workers of Memphis, 90% of whom were black, went on strike for the first time in the history of the city and said that they were not going back to work until there were some basic safety and other kinds of issues addressed. In the 53rd day of the strike, Martin Luther King came back to Memphis for the third time in 3 weeks to support the strikers and to lead a demonstration in Memphis in support of the work they were doing. And so that's really the moment. And looking around the room, many of us were alive in that time, but I think it's incredibly important to remind ourselves of what we actually lived through. It's not only that memories get faulty, it's that life comes in and fills our lives with other things, and to remind ourselves of what the United States and the world were like in 1968 is not a small thing. And for those who were not alive, to acquaint them with what the world and the U.S. were like is one of the most important things that we could do. In January of 1968, the Tet Offensive happened in Vietnam. After having been told for 10 years we were winning the war, it was clear we were losing the war. In February of 1968, Lyndon Johnson's top advisor said, "It's time for you to go. This is not working." In March of 1968, he announced that. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King was killed. In May of 1968, a combination of students and workers in France almost overthrew the government of France. Think about what we consider to be change these days in getting our non-smoking areas pushed farther from the building. That's a good thing. But how about a coalition of students and workers almost overthrowing the government of France in May of 1968? In June of 1968, 2 months to the day after the assassination of King, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. In July and August of 1968, there were enormous upheavals in Prague as we tried to have socialism with a human face, and Soviet tanks crushed that. In August of 1968, the Democratic Convention in Chicago with riots and police riots and violence. Well, that's how 1968 moved. And those of us who were alive and alert and active in those days, I think see that as an almost unique period in U.S. history and in world history. That year is not just any year. And in the middle of that year, Martin Luther King went to Memphis to support people who collect garbage and was assassinated there. The official story has been, for now some 37 years, that he was staying at the Lorraine Motel, that's just right here, in Memphis, Tennessee, and a man named James Earl Ray, across the street in a rooming house above a bar, fired one shot from the bathroom on the second floor, shot Martin Luther King, and changed American history and world history. Ray fled the scene, was arrested later, pled guilty to a plea, and got 99 years in jail. 3 days later, asked to withdraw the plea and spent 29 years trying to get a new trial. He died in 1998, in April of 1998, and it looked as though the case was over, but the family of Martin Luther King over the years had come to believe that Ray was not responsible for King's death, and that in fact a conspiracy had resulted in his death, a conspiracy that involved other people, including elements of the government. And so in the fall of 1999, the family of Martin Luther King, his widow and 4 children, brought a lawsuit against a man named Loyd Jowers in a trial in Memphis, Tennessee. The trial opened November 15th, 1999, concluded on December 8th, 1999. 5 weeks, 70 witnesses. I worked as the media liaison for the family during the trial, and we proved, at least to the satisfaction of the jury, that Loyd Jowers was legally liable in the death of Martin Luther King, and that a conspiracy had resulted in his death. This was after some 30 years of an official story that had been in place, and every textbook in America still says, James O. Ray, comma, the assassin of Martin Luther King, comma, and I dare say most textbooks always will. I don't know what's taught here about that period of history, but I know that in public schools and in virtually all colleges and universities it still says, James O. Ray, comma, the assassin of Martin Luther King, comma, and it probably always will. But for a brief moment in November and December of 1999, a jury in Memphis heard evidence that convinced them otherwise. And it's the only time a jury has heard the evidence the only time a verdict's been rendered, and the verdict revised American history if we're paying attention. So, that's all the way of saying it's good that we're together on this grim anniversary of the death of this man, but that we're still asking questions and talking about what happened that night in Memphis. Since we had 70 witnesses and 5 weeks of testimony, and I have about a half an hour, we won't be covering all of that. What I'll be trying to do is give you a sense of the kind of evidence that was presented, and then we can have a conversation. I think the case is not just a murder mystery, it's that. It's not just a family and a personal human tragedy, it's that. It's not just a national event that still is needing to be looked at, it's certainly that. It's also something that I think has continuing implications for our life. And so we'll look at all those things a little bit. But let me just say, the trial was essentially an opportunity for the family to bring a wrongful death action, much as the families did in the O.J. Simpson trial. After the criminal case was not successful, they brought a wrongful death action, a civil suit, saying that this person, Loyd Jowers, who owned the bar across the street, was legally liable and part of a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. They'd come to believe that over the course of the years, and finally in the winter of 1999 brought the suit. In a civil trial, as this was, you only need a preponderance of evidence. It's not the same standard as in a criminal trial, which means that if you testify and I believe 51-49 you told the truth, I must vote that you told the truth. So it's 51-49. You still need a unanimous verdict, but the standard of evidence is different in a civil case. We went to Memphis in the middle of November, and just 2 quick things. As the jury pool came in, there were about 40 potential jurors coming into the civil courtroom. And as they sat down, I'm sure they thought they were going to be hearing a contentious divorce or medical malpractice or somebody's fender bender or 2 guys arguing about a limb over their fence in their backyard. And the judge, who was one of the pallbearers who carried Martin Luther King's body from the funeral home 30 years before, the judge, in his last case after 30 years on the bench, was going to retire. The judge said, your summons said you'll be here 5 days. He said, I have bad news for you. You're going to be here a lot longer than 5 days. And everybody moaned because it was the week before Thanksgiving. And one of the people actually said, yeah, but next week is Thanksgiving, to which the judge said, I know. I have my calendar straight. But he said, you're going to be here longer than 5 days. And he said, you're actually going to be asked to decide who killed Martin Luther King and whether conspiracy resulted in his death. And I've said it before, and I'm saying it again, I will never forget the faces of those 40 people as they realized that no matter what they decided, they were going to be part of history in a way that they could never have imagined. It was a pizza delivery guy and a mortgage banker and a daycare worker and a teacher and a truck driver and, but they were going to be part of history in a way that they could never have imagined themselves. We got underway with our case. I have to say that since I was working for the plaintiffs, I know both sides of the argument, but what I was there for was to interpret on behalf of the plaintiffs what our witnesses were saying and why it was important. And so I can argue both sides, but I was not there as an objective, neutral person. I was there working with the family. We had 2 major pieces of cases of evidence that I want to go into today. The first was we presented evidence that at the time that Dr. King was assassinated, he was in the Lorraine Motel, but in a situation in which security had been stripped away from him in the prior 24 hours. He arrived at the Lorraine Motel on April 3rd, 1968, 6 o'clock on the evening of the 4th. He was murdered. And in that 24 hours, there was a comprehensive stripping away of security around him. Here's how that happened. First of all, staying at the Lorraine Motel at all was a question that we brought up in the trial. In his prior trips to Memphis, he had usually stayed at larger white-owned hotels downtown. Lorraine Motel was a black-owned hotel in a poor section of Memphis. It's still poor. It always was poor. It's 5 blocks from Beale Street, where the blues were born, and it's the right place for this motel. And so he had never stayed at the Lorraine overnight. But the weekend before the assassination, the FBI had sent out media advisories to hundreds of media outlets saying that when Martin Luther King travels to Memphis, he stays in white-owned hotels. He asks his followers to boycott white businesses, but he enjoys white hotels when there's a perfectly good Negro-owned hotel, the Lorraine. This went out to hundreds of media outlets. It showed up in editorials the weekend before the assassination. It was included in speeches on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So that when King went to Memphis on April 3rd for the first time in his travels there, he stayed at the Lorraine, not in the other hotels where he had stayed in the past. Second, he was originally supposed to be in room 202 on the first floor behind this concrete embankment. But when he got to the hotel, the room was shifted to room 306 on the balcony of the hotel. And right here, much more visible and much more vulnerable in retrospect. If a shot was being fired from across the street, this made a very easy shot, whereas the original room that was supposed to be his was changed at the last minute. How do we know that that happened? Well, a private eye who had been in Memphis that day and talked to the owner of the Lorraine Motel on the day after the assassination said that it was very strange, but yesterday they had been contacted by someone who didn't identify themselves and said we need to switch the doc's room, and so he did. And so that person testified at the trial 30 years after the fact that that had taken place. There was also a black security guard that was formed by homicide detectives in the Memphis Police Department that had usually been with King when he visited Memphis. It was an honor guard. It was something they volunteered to do. They stayed with him 24 hours a day. There were only 9 detectives who were black in the Memphis Police Department in 1968, and they drew on that pool of people to be with King on a 24-hour basis. When they came on April 3rd, that black detective who was in charge of pulling that group together was told, there's no need for you boys to do that. We've made other arrangements this time. And so they were not in place the day that he was assassinated. How do we know that? The person who was used to pulling the group together testified at the trial. Across the street in the fire station, there were 2 black firefighters only assigned there. The night before the assassination, they were called by their superior and told that they were going to be relocated for the next day, that they were going to be sent elsewhere in Memphis, in fact, to white neighborhoods, to firehouses that were overstaffed already, and just for one day in their careers, they were redeployed on April 4th, 1968, and sent elsewhere. So they were not across the street when all of this took place. How do we know that happened? Both of them retired, testified at the trial. And looking back 30 years before, said, I still can't figure out why we were moved one day in our careers and were functioning in a different firehouse just for that day. Across the street, Police Lieutenant Ed Redditt was doing surveillance on behalf of the Red Squad, the Memphis Police Department. At 4 o'clock the afternoon of the assassination, he was approached by superiors. They said, you have to come back to police headquarters. He went back there. They said, there's been a death threat against you. We need to send you home and keep you under protection, so you aren't going to be there for tonight. And an hour later, the assassination took place. The next day, Redditt reported for business as usual, and they said, actually, the threat wasn't against you. It was against another black cop, and, well, technically he was in Knoxville, but we didn't want to take any chances. And so, how do we know that happened? Ed Redditt testified at the trial. Finally, there were 5 tactical units that had been going around the block here, literally nonstop, from the Memphis Police Department. Each car had between 2 and 3 officers in it. And 24 hours before, they were withdrawn to a 5-block radius around the Lorraine Motel. So in fact, the fact he's in the hotel in the first place, the fact the room was changed, the fact the bodyguards are not deployed, the fact that the only black firefighters across the street are not in place to have their ears and eyes open as the murder takes place, the fact that Detective Redditt is withdrawn, and the fact that the tactical units that might have provided some security in the midst of what was taking place are all pulled away to a 5-block radius. One of those things we thought was curious, 2 were interesting, 3 were amazing, and 6 constituted a conspiracy. Because those all happened within 24 hours of the assassination. And my 6 years of Latin tell me that conspiracy simply means People who are breathing together. That's all it means. It doesn't need to mean mental care. It doesn't mean that you're paranoid. It doesn't. A conspiracy means people collaborate together to accomplish a goal. People put this event together today. They either collaborated together or they conspired, depending on your point of view. We conspire all the time. That's how we pay our mortgages. That's how we get through college. That's how we find jobs. That's how we get to go shopping. We cooperate with each other. It's called a conspiracy when you bring it up in this matter. Those 6 things happened, and King is vulnerable at 6 o'clock on the evening of the assassination. At the same time that is happening. At the same time that those who might have protected him, or those who might have seen something that did not jive with what later became the official story, at the same time that's happening, surveillance is increasing at the same moment. So what could have provided some safety and security is stripped away, and in the same 24-hour period, surveillance is increasing. It starts on April 3rd, 1968. Everybody comes to the Lorraine Motel for a staff meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That's where they're going to have the staff meetings. And there's one guy, the comptroller of the SCLC, who's late for the meeting. His name's James Harrison. He was responsible for tracking all of the money coming into the SLC, how it was being spent. If there were any irregularities, you must have a comptroller or some such person here, that person would know about those things. The reason he was late for the SCLC staff meeting is that he was checking in with the FBI office in Memphis because he was a paid informant of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So he flew into Memphis, went to his real employer, the FBI, and then was late getting to the SCLC staff meeting. He's on the inside, providing information about everything going on at the Lorraine Motel. Also, the phones were bugged, the rooms were bugged, as they had been. King had been under surveillance 24 hours a day since 1959 by the FBI, also by military intelligence, also by local red squads and police departments. And so for the last 9 years of his life, there wasn't a moment that he wasn't taped, even in public. And how do we know that? Well, the Memphis Police Department guy who worked as the liaison with all the federal agencies testified at the trial. He wasn't happy to testify, but the subpoena brought him there. At the same time that's happening, over here on the roof of the fire station, something again is happening that never happened before and never happened since. On April 3rd, 1968, 2 photographers show up, identify themselves as being with military intelligence, and ask the chief at the fire station if they can be up on his roof taking films of what's going on at the Lorraine Motel. And they'll just be up there 2 days. And of course, being a patriotic Memphian, he says, wow, that's great. This is some recognition for our fire station. We're going to have military intelligence with cameras on our roof. So he shows them how to get up there. They're there on April 3rd and April 4th, 1968. They were never there before. They haven't been there since. Nobody's ever seen the films that they took, since they were filming at the moment the assassination happened. Now, how do we know it happened? Because we called out of retirement the fire chief, who looks back on April 3rd and 4th, 1968 as 2 days he was proud of, because military intelligence was on the roof of his little fire station 5 blocks from Beale Street. Finally, as the surveillance increased, we must look at this picture, which is the most famous picture taken at the scene of the assassination. It has been reprinted millions of times. Each year on the anniversary, there'll be 4 seconds on TV, or it'll be in Time magazine, or it'll be in your local newspaper. It's been seen millions of times. Dr. King is lying on the balcony at the Morel Motel. Shot once, his head is bleeding, and his aides are around him. Now, this one says, scene of the crime, standing over the fallen, leader on the balcony, pointing in the direction of the shot. Usually the caption says something like his aides or his friends or colleagues or co-workers. Andrew Young is there. There's Andy Young. Down here was Jim Bevel. You can see his bald spot there. Reverend James Orange, Hosea Williams are down there. Jesse Jackson's down there. He runs up later. Ralph Abernathy's coming out of the room. And so, by and large, the caption you see is that colleagues, friends, co-workers are there by his side. The person who's holding his head kneeling down here with a towel is a man named Morel Mccullough. And Morel Mccullough was active in a group of young militants in Memphis called the Invaders. And the Invaders had had some problems with the SCLC, and they were trying to work it out. They were younger. They were not committed to nonviolence. And so King and they were working it out. They even had given them some rooms in the motel. 4 of the Invaders testified at the trial. They now have salt and pepper or gray or white hair. They're not young anymore. They're still militant. But they testified and said that they were working out their problems. And Morel Mccullough was their Minister of Transportation. And they were asked by the attorney how he got to be that, and he said, well, he was the only one of us who owned a car. So we called him the Minister of Transportation, and he took us to meetings, picked us up at meetings. He always knew where we were going to be and where we needed to be in the community. And when the SCLC came to town, he offered to do the same thing for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so, in fact, that day he had been driving around Andy Young and Jim Bevel and some others to the federal court and back to the Lorraine Motel. He was very good. He always knew where people were going to be and when they needed to be picked up and where they needed to be next. And so that's who's holding Martin Luther King's head as he lies dying. Morel Mccullough was not a friend of Dr. King. He's not a colleague or a co-worker. He's there in his official capacity with the Memphis Police Department Red Squad. He's a police infiltrator. He's there on loan from military intelligence, all of which he confessed to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1976, so I didn't make this up. Military intelligence was paying a salary, loaned him to the Memphis PD to infiltrate the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so in this photograph that has been seen a million times, these are not friends, co-workers, and colleagues exclusively. The person holding Martin Luther King's head as he lies dying is an undercover cop paid for by military intelligence. So as security is being stripped away, surveillance is absolutely smothering King. In the aftermath of the assassination, he's shot at 6 o'clock, the ambulance arrives, and 7 o'clock he's declared dead at the local hospital. In the aftermath around the United States, there is an enormous response. There are riots in hundreds of cities. 38 people died in those riots. The whole world is in turmoil at the death of Martin Luther King. And the alleged assassin, James Earl Ray, was in Memphis that day, was in that building that day, in fact. And so he flees the scene, and he's on the lam for 2 months and 4 days, and he's arrested in England in June of 1968. Brought back, put on trial, pleads guilty, worst mistake of his life. 3 days later, tries to withdraw the plea and spends 29 years trying to get back in court. The version of this murder that we were presenting was different from that official story. It said that the man, Loyd Jowers, who we were suing, owned the bar across the street, just about 150 feet from where King was shot, and that he, in fact, had been in the backyard behind the bar at the moment that it took place. The shot had been fired from there, and that Jowers had been handed the gun and took control of the gun after that. That's what we were alleging. That's what we were trying to prove. That's what the jury came to believe. And Jowers himself had admitted most of that because he had been talking about it outside of court over the 6 years prior to the trial. So his attorney had a daunting task. His client had pretty much admitted to 80% of what we were alleging, hadn't done it under oath and hadn't done it in a courtroom, but had been bragging to people about his role. It was on the basis of that the family decided to bring the lawsuit. There were a number of other important things that we did in the course of the trial. That's about 10 of the 12 witnesses out of 70. One of the other areas that we looked at was on the morning after the assassination, on the morning after. The head of the Department of Public Works in Memphis was called by the Memphis Police Department and told to go to this area from which we believe the shot was fired, this area back here. It was covered with trees and brush and bushes. You literally couldn't walk from one end to the other. That's how dense it was. When the police arrived on the scene, they had a hard time moving in that area. That's where we said the shot was fired from. 3 people testified that they had seen someone there, either a puff of smoke or firing or some movement taking place. But on the morning after the assassination, the Department of Public Works was contacted and asked to clean out the area. All the trees were cut down. All the shrubs were removed. All the undergrowth was cleared away. It then looked, by April 5th, 1968, almost like a mini golf course. It was so clean. And the night before, it had been not like that. Whatever physical evidence would have been there was no longer there. Whatever contamination of the crime scene you could imagine with people doing that, all of that is what took place. And so how did we know that happened? Well, the retired head of the Department of Public Works came and testified at the trial and said it was a funny request, but we were there by 7 o'clock and we did a crackerjack job. He still didn't know 31 years later that he'd been responsible for contaminating the crime scene, so he wasn't a conspiracy nut, he wasn't a political person, he was just remembering the fact that he got a call and by 7 o'clock they were out there and took care of business. They got the job done, as we say now about everything, from wars in Iraq to winning a basketball game. Well, he got the job done at 7 o'clock on the morning after the assassination, and the crime scene was no longer going to yield any real clues. At the same time that that was happening in the backyard, the official crime scene, which was the second floor of this rooming house above the bar, somebody testified at the trial that he had in fact gone to the crime scene. He was a homicide detective with the NYPD for 25 years and then retired in Memphis. And he said after you investigate murders for 25 years and a murder occurs, you just go down to the scene, you can't stop yourself. So he said just out of curiosity on April 5th, 1968, he went down to the crime scene. He said there was no yellow tape around, there was nobody guarding the crime scene. I walked into the rooming house, I walked up to the second floor. I was in the room that Ray had rented the day before. I went in the bathroom and stood in the bathtub from which he allegedly fired the shot. And nobody was around. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked me a question. And we know that because he testified at the trial that that's what happened that day as he went down to the scene of the crime. The testimony went on for weeks. The defense had its turn. And when it came time for us to conclude our case, we put Dexter King on the stand. We had opened the case with Coretta King, and we closed with Dexter. He talked about what it was like to lose his father at the age of 7. He talked about what the last 30 years had been like. But then, because the main allegation in the press had been that the King family was utilizing the trial to make money, he also was the one who testified to what they expected from Loyd Jowers. And he said they wanted $100 and they would donate that to the retirement fund of the garbage workers. And so Dexter was our last witness, and with that the plaintiffs closed their case. The defense did what they could. All Loyd Jowers' lawyer could really say was that lots of other people were involved. Okay, we were ready to accept that. And then he said Loyd didn't know who was staying at the Lorraine Motel. He was busy running the bar and didn't know that literally the most famous human being in the world was staying across the street. So if he took a rifle from somebody, he didn't even know who was going to be shot. So he was just a small cog in a big machine. That may have all been true as well. But the jury believed the case that we had presented, took an hour, and found for the plaintiffs that Jowers was legally liable and that there had been a conspiracy that resulted in his death. And the main thing is that when the press came to the trial, they were there the first day when Mrs. King and her children came into the courtroom. They were there the last day when the verdict was announced, but they by and large were not there for the 5 weeks in which all of the testimony was presented. And so even if people are aware of the fact that a trial took place, that even that the verdict was in favor of the family, even if they're aware of that, by and large folks are not aware of the kind of evidence that was put in the record for the first time in the case 31 years after the murder. The fact that so many witnesses were still alive with their memories intact, able and willing and wanting to testify was something of a miracle. The fact that that's all on the record and that there are 4,000 pages in the transcript for future generations to examine and to take a look at. One of the goals of the family was just to have that testimony on the record, regardless of what the jury decided. They were interested in presenting that and having it in that kind of formal record. In the years since the case, I think, at least in the conversations that I had with people, it has been important to say a couple of things. One, the trial was for us certainly a human tragedy. It was first about a family who'd lost a father and a husband. It was a national tragedy, but it was also a lens through which to see what was going on in America in those days, and regrettably, what continues to go on in many ways in our country and in the world. And so the case was for us not simply a murder and not simply that kind of tragedy, but was also a lens through which to look at some other things. What we recovered, I think, in the course of this was that the figure who's presented on the anniversary, on the birthday anniversary, the figure of Martin Luther King, the iconic Martin Luther King now, who gets the 12 seconds of the I Have a Dream speech every January 15th or January 20th, depending on when the holiday falls. That figure has very little to do with who was actually alive and struggling and sacrificing and frightening those in power in the mid-60s. That in fact King was viewed not as a kind of gentle, benign figure that now gets invoked by all kinds of people, especially on the anniversary, as a kind of nice, grandfatherly person who thought we should all get along. That has very little to do with who was taking on the war, who was taking on the gap between the rich and the poor, and who was continuing to struggle for civil and human rights to the point of giving his life for it. And so part of looking at his death has invited us to look much more seriously at what his life was about. Because the iconic figure who's dragged out of the mothballs every January 15th is not Martin Luther King. It may be someone else. But the person who was shot on April 4th, 1968 was not that benign fellow. Dexter says that people have relegated his father to I Have a Dreamland, which he says is sort of like a theme park that everybody goes to once a year. He's in I Have a Dreamland. Let's get out the clip. And that it really isn't what it was about. The last thing I would want to say is that the family, I think, showed great courage in bringing the case. They met with nothing but criticism. Every national media outlet said they were either crazy or mercenary. Those were the two options. And so when we went to Memphis to do this, they knew that they were not going to get any credit from anybody, but at least they felt as though they had, in fact, done what they owed their loved one and had established to the best as they could what the truth was in the case. Their courage, it seems to me, also reminded us of what King was about. And let me just close. I'm as interested in his life as in his death, but they're all very woven together for me. And so courage is not in great supply these days. And there's lots of documentaries that are dragged out in January. PBS had one this year. It was pretty good. And then there are other ones around. But I saw footage last year that I hadn't seen before. King is standing making a speech at a press conference after the 3 civil rights workers are murdered in Mississippi. So Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner are dead. And behind King are the people responsible for their deaths. The sheriff, the deputy sheriff, the people who worked in their office. And King, I'd seen this clip before, King is standing there holding a press conference and saying, I am saying these things maybe in the ears of those who killed Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. And over his shoulder, you see Cecil Price and what's the other guy's name? Rainey, I think, looking at each other and making eye contact. Here's 50 cameras on them. And they were so brutal and ugly and stupid that they make eye contact. But here's Martin Luther King standing in front of these guys, telling the truth. I think that kind of courage gets lost in the 15-second soundbite, and he was willing to do what he could. I think what the case reminded us about was also that as seriously as he took the world around him, particularly U.S. adventures overseas, the impact all this had on the poor, the way in which the life of most people in the world was not getting better in his lifetime, but getting worse. As seriously as he took all of this, I think is an invitation for us, not in a maudlin memorial sense, but simply in an ongoing serious sense, to take equally seriously the moment in which we find ourselves. If he had heard the lies that we've heard for the last 4 years, I think he would have said, "Truth crushed to earth will rise again." He liked that line. If he had seen what was going on in the way in which the world is being brutalized on a daily basis, I think he would have said something he said a lot. You know, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I think what he said then, unfortunately, is equally relevant now, and the real challenge of his life and in death is whether we're up to carrying forward. So thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you.